So our job as software developers is to author code which is using a language that's human readable and author in such a way that can be understood and parsed and interpreted and ultimately then executed by a computer. And the code that we write, we save into files and we ask some execution environment, whether it be a web browser or in this case Node, to take a look at this code that we wrote in this file and to interpret it and to execute it. All right. And so it's important, first of all, as we get started, understand that how our code is going to be used. We're working and learning the JavaScript language, but ultimately the code that we write will be executed in, let's be honest, one of two, maybe even a third environment. We're either going to write JavaScript code that will ultimately be executed in Node, and typically when we're writing code for Node-based applications, we're writing applications that can access the file system, access the network, respond to HTTP requests, and provide an HTTP response, things that are more server-side in nature. All right. And then we'll also then write JavaScript code that will execute in the context of a web browser. And we would expect for that code to be able to dynamically interact with elements, HTML elements on a given web page. All right. But we might also use JavaScript to write video games in an environment like Unity, for example, and be able to author and control the various objects on screen and their animation and their interaction and so on. So what I'm trying to get at here is that there's a difference between the language itself and then the environment that it runs inside of. And we need to be aware of that those are two separate things, even though sometimes they feel like one thing. In this case, console, for example, the console.log function is provided to us by Node. It allows us to tell Node that we want to print something to the command line like we did just a moment ago. Now there's also a console.log function in most web browsers, and it allows us to print little debugging messages or console messages that can only be viewed inside of a web browser whenever we have the developer tools open. And we'll see how to do that much later in this course once we start building web pages and JavaScript that can interact with them. But at any rate, let's get back to the matter at hand here. If I write my JavaScript incorrectly, then the runtime, whether it's Node or a web browser, won't be able to compile it, and it'll give us an error. And so JavaScript is similar to English in so much that JavaScript has a syntax, and it has a proper syntax versus a syntax that's incorrect. So if you've ever taken an English class, you'll know that there are parts of speech that you're supposed to use punctuation at the end of a sentence to indicate the end of a complete thought. There are nouns and verbs and adjectives and adverbs and prepositions and all these sorts of things, right? And so, in general terms, the same thing is true with JavaScript. There are parts of speech. We'll talk about those. And so you will be learning a new language, starting with your ABCs and with I guess vocabulary words, so to speak, and then to move on to authoring sentences that are complete thoughts, and then stringing those sentences together into paragraphs in order to accomplish some higher level task, and even kind of arranging those paragraphs together to create entire applications. All right. So hopefully that analogy will serve you well as we get started here. Our goal as we get started is to author JavaScript statements. And a statement is basically just one complete instruction. It's like a sentence in English. And each JavaScript file that we create, like this app.js, it'll contain one or more JavaScript statements that will execute in sequential order from top to bottom, at least usually. And I'll talk about the exception to that as we get further into this course. But there are some other similarities between JavaScript and English. For example, there's an end-of-line character. I was very, very specific about adding that semicolon at the end of our statement. And that just is an indication to the compiler that this is a complete thought and it should be carried out as is. All right. Now, we also see that we have our statement all on one line of code. And generally speaking, as we're getting started, we're going to write our JavaScript statements one per line. Now, we'll bend those rules as some of our statements become very long. We can actually, for readability's sake, from a human perspective, we can split things up onto multiple lines if we need to. JavaScript, specifically Node, doesn't really care about that. That's really more for human readability. It can deal with multiple lines or a single line for a given statement. But be that as it may, we're going to try to strive at the beginning to write one statement per line in our files. And a statement usually consists of one or more expressions. So we'll talk about expressions a little bit later, but this particular expression is essentially just executing a function that's built into Node. It's the log function. It belongs to an object called console. We'll talk about objects and functions a little bit later here. And we execute it by using operators. Those, in this particular case, this is the function invocation operator or the method invocation operator. It's those open and closing parentheses. And we can even then pass in what are called arguments to those functions. So you can see that each little piece of this has a name and it has a role to play in creating our functions, and we'll learn more about that as we move on here. One thing to note is that JavaScript is case sensitive, and this trips up a lot of people to begin with. That's why I was very specific to say, hey, don't accidentally or mindlessly use capital letters. Make sure everything is lowercase. Let's see what happens if I were to save this work that I did here with the capital C in console and the capital L in log. Let's go node space app and hit enter, and we get a reference error. Console is not defined. It's not defined inside of Node. Console doesn't exist with a capital C inside of Node. It exists with a lowercase c inside of Node. The same thing is true with the function name log. Let's go ahead and I'll just use the up arrow on my keyboard. That'll give me the last command that was used in the terminal. So again, node app, and I'm going to try to execute this little program again, and I get another error. This time, console.capital log is not a function. That's true. It's because it's lowercase l in log, and I'll save that change and then we'll re-execute this and it will work. Now there are some things that, especially when your application is small, don't matter. So you might have accidentally left off that semicolon at the end and the application still runs, but that's a bad practice to rely on that. You should always try to create properly formed sentences, even though you could write an English sentence or a text message that somebody could understand that has no punctuation, has no capital letters and things of that nature that would make it a well-formed English sentence. And you're relying on the person receiving that text message to understand what you're trying to say. The computer doesn't work that way. It needs to know exactly what you're saying, and so you have to be precise. Precision is the key as a software developer. All right, so what I want to do here as we kind of start wrapping things up for this first foray into JavaScript, I'm going to comment out this line and add some new code below it and use that as kind of the next step beyond where we're at right now. So to tell the compiler to ignore a line of code, I'm going to add a code comment. And here I use 2 forward slashes. I added also a space, but that was really just for readability's sake, so that myself as a human, I can kind of make an easy distinction, because sometimes all these characters run together. I like adding a space between this. But these two characters say, forget everything on this line of code. Don't compile it. Don't try to use it. All right. And we'll see in a moment that there's another way to create code comments as well. But here, let's create something a little bit more interesting. I'm going to say let x equal 7. I'm going to say let y equal 3. Let z equal x plus y. And then we'll do console.log. And then I'm going to use open and close parentheses. I'm going to use a single quote. I'm going to type in the word answer, colon, space. I'm going to go outside of that quote. So I'm going to go between the closing single quote and the closing parenthesis, and I'm going to make some space for myself in there. I'm going to use the plus key, or the plus operator, and the letter Z. I'm going to go to the end of the line and use the end of line character, the semicolon. I'm going to save it all. Now, before we actually execute this, what do you think this will do? What do you think will be printed to our console window? Do you have any guesses? Well, I'm betting that your background in math or algebra probably will lead you to the correct answer. And I think that your intuition in many cases is something that's important as you're learning JavaScript. It is human readable. It should be somewhat understandable. It might require a little extra explanation because there's some things that are not extremely obvious, but for the most part, this shouldn't blow you away, and nothing we cover should ever blow you away. It just might require a little extra effort than you're normally used to putting into things, but by no means impossible, right? So just take some comfort that this is well-traveled ground, and that if I can understand it, I promise you can too. Let's run the application and see that we get the correct result, which is answer, colon, space, and the number 10. So how do we get that? Well, we have something here, let X. And even though, again, you're not a JavaScript developer, or an advanced JavaScript developer just yet, I'm willing to bet that you understood that we were creating a variable, essentially, a bucket that could contain a value. And immediately we set that variable equal to the value 7. And then we did the same thing with the value of 3. We put that into a different variable, a different bucket called y. And then here we have an expression that will add two values together. What are the values inside of those variables x and y? Well, we just assign them in lines 3 and 4. And we know that that probably means we're going to add those together to get the result of 10. And we assign that into a new bucket, a new variable named z. And then we merely print out that literal string. But then we also say also append the letter or the value that's in z. Now, hopefully that made sense to you even before we ran the application. But you can see here that, for example, the plus symbol has double duty. It's serving to be the addition operator, but it's also serving to concatenate two values together. In this case, two string values together so that we can print it out to screen. So we're going to use this kind of as a starting point and talk about this at more length in the next and subsequent videos. But hopefully up to this point, you get some comfort level. You're writing some code. You're getting your hands dirty in the code. And, I know you can do this. So just keep pushing forward, and let's pick it up in the next video. We'll see you there. Thanks.